The early era. The story of jiu-jitsu begins long before it became a global sport, back when it was still just a handful of techniques being shared, tested, and adapted. In the early 1900s, a Japanese judoka named Mitsuyo Maeda, also known as Count Koma, traveled the world as both a teacher and a fighter. Maeda was part of a wave of martial artists spreading judo internationally, and his journey took him across Europe, North America, and eventually to Brazil. Along the way, he fought wrestlers, boxers, and even strongmen in challenge matches, showing that throws and submissions could neutralize almost any style. When Maeda finally settled in Brazil in the 1910s, he began teaching, and one of his students was Carlos Gracie. Carlos absorbed Maeda's teachings and introduced them to his brothers. Among them was Helio Gracie, who would end up reshaping the art more than anyone else. Helio was small, frail, and sickly as a child. He couldn't rely on strength or athleticism the way his brothers did, so he began to modify the techniques. Instead of explosive throws, he emphasized leverage, and instead of trying to muscle through holds, he learned how to survive, wait, and use timing to turn the tide. Out of necessity, Helio laid the foundation for what became known as Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. At this stage, Jiu-Jitsu wasn't a sport. It was about proving whether the system worked in real fights. The Gracie family became notorious for their challenge matches, where they would invite fighters from any style, boxing, karate, capoeira, and wrestlers to step onto the mat or into a ring with them. They were often brutal fights with very few rules, known as veil tudo, literally meaning anything goes. Helio himself fought men who outweighed him by 50, even 80 pounds. In many of these matches, he was battered but survived, showing that his system of leverage and submissions could keep a smaller fighter safe against giants. These early fights built the mythology of jiu-jitsu. Newspapers covered the Gracies as a family of fighters who could neutralize anyone. For spectators, it wasn't just entertainment, it was a revelation that technique and strategy could overcome brute strength. That philosophy became the soul of the art. The idea that a smaller, weaker person can defeat a bigger, stronger opponent through technique was proven again and again in those gritty challenge matches. The techniques of the early era reflected that philosophy. The closed guard, for example, became a symbol of survival and a way to tie up a stronger opponent, neutralize strikes, and slowly work toward a submission. Basic escapes, arm locks, chokes, and sweeps were drilled relentlessly, not with the goal of scoring points, but of ending a fight or surviving long enough to find an opening. Everything was rooted in practicality. You weren't training to win medals, you were training so that if someone jumped you in an alley or challenged you in a ring, you could walk away in one piece. But as effective as it was, jiu-jitsu in this era was still very limited in scope. It was a family-run practice passed from teacher to student in small circles. Outside of Brazil, almost nobody even knew it existed, and inside Brazil, it was respected but niche. This was not yet the global sport we know today. There were no massive tournaments, no streaming matches, no belt promotions happening worldwide. It was a fighting art in its rawest form. What's remarkable about the early era is how much of its DNA still exists in modern jiu-jitsu. They remain the core of the art, even as new rule sets and styles have taken jiu-jitsu in completely different directions. The early era was all about proving the art's legitimacy. It gave jiu-jitsu its identity and its credibility. But as the decades rolled on, the art entered a period where growth stalled, divisions formed, and jiu-jitsu risked fading into obscurity. The Transition Era. If the early era of jiu-jitsu was about proving its effectiveness, the next chapter, often called the Transition Era, was about growth, struggle, and laying the groundwork for the sport we know today. From the 1960s through the 1980s, jiu-jitsu remained almost entirely confined to Brazil. It wasn't yet the global powerhouse it would become, but inside those academies in Rio, the art was evolving at a rapid pace. This was the period when jiu-jitsu began to move away from being just a family art and started to become a true sport. Academies began running their own tournaments, experimenting with point systems, and testing what worked in competition. There was no universal rulebook yet, and both points and rules varied depending on the event. This was also the era when rivalries between academies started. The Gracie family itself had split into different schools, each with their own philosophies. Helio Gracie and his followers emphasized the old-school mindset of patience, survival, and efficiency. Carlson Gracie, on the other hand, broke away and built a team around aggression, pressure, and offense. His fighters weren't just trying to win, they were trying to dominate. That shift in style gave rise to champions like Murilo Bustamante, Ricardo de la Riva, and Walid Ismail, all competitors who would later shape entire generations of grapplers. The culture was fierce. Gym wars were common, with academies sending fighters to challenge one another and prove which style was superior. Training was intense, loyalty to your team was absolute, and stepping into another academy's territory often meant conflict. For outsiders, it might have looked chaotic, but for practitioners, it was the crucible that forged the next wave of champions. At the same time, this was an era when jiu-jitsu was still underground. Unlike judo, which had Olympic status, or karate, which spread worldwide, jiu-jitsu had almost no international presence. There were no magazines, no instructionals, no global tournaments. Knowledge was passed directly from instructor to student, often in small, sweaty academies with bare mats and little fanfare. Outside of Brazil, hardly anyone even knew what jiu-jitsu was. But beneath that obscurity, the art was quietly expanding. This was when many of the modern guard positions first appeared. Ricardo de la Riva's famous guard was born during this period, changing how smaller athletes could control and attack bigger opponents with the de la Riva guard. Sweeps, pressure passing, and guard retention became more sophisticated as competitors experimented and refined their games in local tournaments. Even though the spotlight wasn't there yet, the technical base for modern competition was being built. The transition era wasn't glamorous. Prize money was almost non-existent, opportunities were limited, and most athletes had to work side jobs to support their training. But the practitioners of this time carried the art forward when it could easily have stagnated. They sharpened it, expanded it, and turned it from a family legacy into a broader martial art. Looking back, the transition era feels like the bridge that carried jiu-jitsu from the world of Vale Tudo and challenge matches into the world of structured tournaments and organized competition. Without this period of internal rivalries, underground tournaments, and technical innovation, jiu-jitsu wouldn't have been ready for the explosion that came next. Because in the 1990s, Carlos Gracie Jr. would create the IBJJF, and with it, jiu-jitsu would finally step onto the global stage. The IBJJF era. By the time the 1990s rolled around, jiu-jitsu was ready to leave its underground roots behind. For decades, the art had survived on challenge matches, regional tournaments, and fierce academy rivalries. But if it was going to become a legitimate global sport, it needed something else: structure. That structure came through the Carlos Gracie Jr., who in 2002 formally established the International Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Federation, better known as the IBJJF. In truth, the groundwork for this era had already been laid in the late 1990s. The IBJJF World Championships, commonly called Worlds, were first held in 1996, even before the federation was officially in place. From the very beginning, Worlds set itself apart as the ultimate proving ground for Gi competition. Winning gold there wasn't just about a medal, it meant you had achieved legitimacy in the sport. Legends like Roger Gracie, Marcelo Garcia, Marcus Almeida, and the Mendez brothers cemented their legacies on those mats. A single win at Worlds could change a competitor's career, and multiple wins made you immortal in the eyes of the jiu-jitsu community. But Worlds was only part of what made the IBJJF era so important. The federation created a global calendar of major events like the Pan Ams in North America, the Europeans for the rapidly growing European scene, and the Brasileiros in Brazil itself. Together, these tournaments formed a year-round circuit that gave jiu-jitsu its first real professional season. Athletes no longer had to rely on one-off matches or local tournaments to prove themselves. They now had a ladder to climb and a stage that brought together the best grapplers from around the world. The organization also brought standards. Before its creation, rules varied from place to place, making it hard to measure skill across regions. The federation solved this by unifying the point system with takedowns, sweeps, guard passes, mount, and back control, which all carried specific values. Whether you were competing in Sao Paulo, Lisbon, or Los Angeles, the rules were the same. This consistency gave jiu-jitsu an international identity. Gyms everywhere began training athletes not just to fight, but to fight under the organization's rules, and the federation's rulebook became the default framework for how the art was taught. Of course, the IBJJF era wasn't just about organization, it was also about innovation. The guard game exploded during this time. Athletes developed advanced positions like the berimbolo, worm guard, and lapel guards that were perfectly suited to the federation's point system. Competitors like the Mendes brothers and Leandro Lo pushed the boundaries of what was possible, turning what was once seen as stalling into highly technical, tactical battles. The GI became a laboratory for creativity, and the results influenced how the sport evolved worldwide. But with that prestige came plenty of criticism. Many athletes and fans accused the federation of prioritizing profit over competitors. Registration fees were notoriously high, sometimes hundreds of dollars per athlete, and black belts were required to pay annual membership fees just to compete. Entire teams spent thousands to attend major tournaments, only to find that prize money was minimal or non-existent compared to the costs. For years, grapplers at the highest level were essentially competing for glory, not financial reward, even as the federation profited. The rules themselves also drew fire. While the point system was designed to reward positional dominance, critics argued that it often encouraged stalling. Matches at the highest level sometimes devolved into battles for grips, advantages, or minor point leads rather than submission attempts. To casual fans, watching world champions win 2-0 or by a single advantage felt boring. Some even claimed that the IBJJF had created a style of jiu-jitsu that was safe and strategic, but not always exciting. And then there was the issue of adaptation. For years, the federation banned heel hooks and other leg entanglements that were exploding in popularity in no GI competitions. While organizations like ADCC embraced the leg lock revolution, the IBJJF resisted change, frustrating athletes who felt the federation was holding back the evolution of the sport. Politics and accusations of favoritism only added to the criticism, leaving many athletes with a love-hate relationship with the federation. Yet despite all the backlash, the IBJJF era cemented itself as one of the most important in jiu-jitsu history. Its tournaments became the benchmark of legitimacy, its rulebook became the global standard, and its champions from Roger Gracie to Marcelo Garcia and Buchecha became household names in the grappling world. But as the 2000s rolled further, another shift began to take place. Grapplers started stepping away from the gi and into a different arena, and that shift would mark the beginning of the next era in jiu-jitsu's evolution, the no-gi era. While the IBJJF was building structure and prestige around the traditional uniform, another wave was starting to take shape. This was the rise of submission grappling without the kimono, a shift that would transform jiu-jitsu into something bigger than it had ever been. From the late 1990s through the 2010s, what had once been a side project grew into a discipline of its own, with its own legends, rules, and culture. The roots of this era trace back to the Abu Dhabi Combat Club World Championship, better known as ADCC. Created in 1998 by Sheikh Tahnoon bin Zayed Al Nahyan, ADCC was never meant to be just another jiu-jitsu tournament. It was built to be the Olympics of grappling, a place where wrestlers, judokas, sambo specialists, catch wrestlers, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belts could all compete under one unified rule set. The format was unique. Matches began with a scoreless period to encourage submission hunting, then shifted into a point phase where positional control mattered. Submissions of all kinds, including heel hooks and reaping, were legal. This openness created an environment completely different from the IBJJF. From the very beginning, ADCC felt like something new. It crowned champions who became legends: Ricardo Arona, Marcelo Garcia, Roger Gracie, Andre Galvão. Garcia, in particular, embodied the spirit of ADCC, submitting much larger opponents and proving that grappling without the gi could be just as technical, dynamic, and beautiful. Held every 2 years, ADCC quickly became the biggest stage in the world, and winning gold there was seen as the ultimate accomplishment. But this era was never just about ADCC. It was also about the identity of jiu-jitsu itself beginning to change. In the early 2000s, Eddie Bravo introduced his 10th Planet system, removing the gi entirely and building positions that worked for MMA and pure submission grappling. His rubber guard, lockdown, and twister proved that this style had its own innovations, not just stripped-down versions of traditional techniques. Around the same time, shows like Grappler's Quest and Polaris gave athletes more professional opportunities. Submission-only formats began to gain traction, shifting the focus away from points and toward finishes. Fans loved it because it felt less like a tactical chess match and more like a fight. By the mid-2000s, training without the kimono was no longer just preparation for MMA. It had become a sport in its own right. A generation of athletes began to specialize in it. Gary Tonin became famous for his scrambles and relentless submission attempts. Marcelo Garcia's students carried his aggressive, fan-friendly style into this new environment. Wrestlers like Ben Askren and Jake Shields crossed over, proving that this faster, slipperier form of grappling welcomed athletes from all backgrounds. For fans, the era was refreshing. Without heavy grips and friction, the pace was faster, scrambles were harder to control, and submissions came out of nowhere. Heel hooks and leg entanglements became regular weapons, something the IBJJF still resisted at the time. The style also looked closer to MMA grappling, which made it easier for UFC fans to appreciate. Fighters like Georges St-Pierre, BJ Penn, and Demian Maia all credited their success to jiu-jitsu, and this style of competition made the connection between the sports stronger than ever. Of course, debates came with it. Traditionalists argued that by moving away from the kimono, grapplers were skipping important fundamentals, and that the new style was too chaotic, less technical, and overly reliant on athleticism. Supporters argued the opposite, saying it was more realistic, more exciting, and far more open to innovation. The debate still exists today, but by the end of the 2010s, there was no denying that submission grappling had established itself as a discipline of its own. The Abu Dhabi Combat Club World Championship was bigger than ever. Submission-only shows had built loyal audiences, and a new generation of athletes trained almost exclusively without the gi. But just as the grappling world was settling into this new identity, another revolution was about to change everything: the systematic rise of leg locks. What began as a niche strategy would soon define an entire era. The leg lock era. By the mid-2010s, submission grappling had already carved out its place as a sport of its own. Submission grappling organizations was thriving, submission-only shows were gaining fans, and a new generation of athletes was specializing in the rash guard style of competition. But then came a technical revolution that would completely reshape the game: the rise of systematic leg locks. Leg attacks had always existed in jiu-jitsu. Heel hooks, knee bars, and toe holds were known, but for decades they were treated as dirty tricks or shortcuts rather than serious strategies. Many traditional academies even banned them altogether, insisting that leg locks were dangerous and lacked the sophistication of passing, mounting, or taking the back. For a long long time, the message was clear. If you relied on leg locks, you were playing a cheap game. That perception changed almost overnight. John Danaher, a coach based in New York City, began building a group of athletes who approached leg locks differently. Instead of treating them as one-off moves, he created entire systems around them with entries, control positions, transitions, and finishes that left opponents with no escape. His students, later known as the Danaher Death Squad, began tearing through competition. Gary Tonin made waves in submission-only formats, but it was Gordon Ryan who truly carried the system onto the biggest stage, dominating high-level tournaments and proving that leg locks weren't just effective, they were unstoppable when applied with precision. Matches were no longer decided just by guard passes or sweeps. Suddenly, athletes had to fear their legs being attacked at every moment. The revolution spread fast. Gyms that had once ignored leg locks were now scrambling to study them. Competitors who dismissed them were getting tapped in front of packed crowds. The entire meta of grappling shifted in just a few short years. For fans, the leg lock era was electrifying. Submissions were happening faster. Matches felt more dangerous. Athletes who had once been considered average suddenly had a weapon that could take out world champions. Watching an underdog catch a heel hook on a superstar gave this era a level of unpredictability that had been missing. Every scramble had consequences, and every mistake could mean instant defeat. Of course, the leg lock era also brought its critics. Traditionalists argued that the focus on legs made grappling one-dimensional, with athletes sitting to guard and diving for ankles instead of building complete games. Others felt it was unsafe, pointing to the devastating injuries heel hooks can cause if applied or resisted carelessly. But no matter the criticism, the results spoke for themselves. The athletes who embraced the system won, and the ones who resisted fell behind. The leg lock era didn't just add a new submission to the arsenal. It changed the way the entire sport thought about control, risk, and strategy. It forced evolution at every level, from white belts in local gyms to champions on the world's biggest stages. The modern era. The 2000s and 20s marked what many call the modern era of jiu-jitsu, a period where the sport has gone from underground to global, from niche tournaments to professional events with millions of viewers, and from a community-based art to a stage with personalities, controversies, and money at the center. The clearest example of this transformation came with ADCC 2022. Held in Las Vegas, it wasn't just another grappling tournament, it was a spectacle. Thousands of fans packed the Thomas and Mack Center with professional production, live commentary, walkouts, and worldwide streaming. For the first time, grappling felt like it was being presented on the same level as MMA or boxing. The matches themselves delivered history. Gordon Ryan cemented himself as the most dominant submission grappler of all time, tearing through his division and then defeating Andre Galvao in the super fight in front of a roaring crowd. Rising stars like Cade Rotolo showed that a new generation was ready to carry the torch, bringing energy and creativity to the mats. But ADCC isn't the only name in town anymore. In 2024, Craig Jones shocked the community by launching the Craig Jones Invitational. Frustrated with low payouts and poor treatment of athletes, Craig put together an event that guaranteed million-dollar prizes for winners and paydays for every competitor. His viral promotion, where he dumped a duffel bag full of cash on Joe Rogan's table, set the tone. Craig's Invitational wasn't just a tournament, it was a movement. The tournament had fights like the B-Team versus New Wave and Helena Cravar versus Sarah Galvao. Craig also donated hundreds of thousands to charity, proving that grappling could entertain and give back at the same time. Fans loved the chaos, the humor, and the authenticity. Critics called it gimmicky or unsustainable, but no one could ignore it. For the first time, grapplers were being treated like professionals with life-changing money on the line. Meanwhile, the UFC entered the grappling game with UFC BJJ, launching its own league in 2025. Instead of copying existing tournaments, the UFC built something new. Matches were held in a small, bowl-shaped cage, scored with the same 10-point must system used in MMA. Champions like Mikey Musumeci, Andrew Tackett, and Mason Fowler were crowned in front of massive online audiences, with millions watching free streams on YouTube. By refusing to allow athletes with admitted steroid use, like Gordon Ryan, the UFC made a bold statement about legitimacy. For many fans, this was their first real taste of high-level grappling outside of the UFC cage, and it gave the sport a mainstream push that had been missing for decades. Alongside these big organizations, streaming platforms and social media have transformed how fans consume grappling. A match that once would have been seen by a few hundred people in a gym is now clipped, shared, and debated by millions online within hours. Personalities like Mikey Musumeci, Craig Jones, and Gordon Ryan have become stars not just for what they do on the mats, but for their presence off them. Mikey is loved for his humility, quirkiness, and authenticity. Craig has built a fan base with his dry humor, honesty, and willingness to challenge the system. Gordon, meanwhile, continues to dominate while embracing the villain role, openly admitting to steroid use and stirring drama at every turn. Whether you love them or hate them, these personalities have given grappling storylines, rivalries, and hype that keep fans engaged beyond just the techniques. Of course, the modern era isn't without controversy. Steroid use remains one of the biggest debates in the sport. Gordon Ryan's admissions have divided fans, with some arguing that steroids are an open secret in grappling, and others insisting that clean athletes are being robbed of fair competition. competition. At the same time, the technical side of the sport has never been deeper. The leg lock revolution is no longer just a revolution. It's the norm. Every serious grappler now trains entries, defenses, and counters. But it hasn't stopped there. Back takes, wrestling integration, and hybrid styles are evolving faster than ever. Athletes like the Ruotolo brothers are blending traditional jiu-jitsu with dynamic wrestling scrambles. Mikey Musumeci has shown how smaller athletes can still thrive at the highest level with precision and innovation. And teams like New Wave, B-Team, Atos, and DreamArt are constantly pushing each other to refine the game. What makes the modern era unique is that jiu-jitsu is finally being treated as both a martial art and an entertainment product. Fans expect high-level technique, but they also want storylines, rivalries, and big personalities to follow. Athletes are no longer just competitors, they are brands, with podcasts, instructional videos, and massive social media platforms. In many ways, jiu-jitsu today mirrors the early UFC, where a niche martial art exploded into something mainstream because it was equal parts sport and spectacle. The modern era is still being written. What we do know is that jiu-jitsu has never had more visibility, more controversy, or more momentum than it does today. From the crowded academies of Rio to sold-out arenas in Las Vegas, the journey has been incredible, and right now we're living through the most exciting, unpredictable era the sport has ever seen. If you came this far, let me know down in the comments by writing black belt, and don't forget to subscribe for more content.